What if the price of fixing Britain's economy fell on those who've already paid their dues? As pressure mounts on Labour to target the ultra-wealthy, Chancellor Rachel Reeves is quietly weighing a very different path, one that's already raising eyebrows and fueling controversy. Behind closed doors, a dramatic decision is taking shape, and it could come at the expense of some of the nation's most vulnerable. Let's break it down, but first, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more. We have released our new 0% Liberal t-shirts. You can find them at britishstand.com or go to the link in the description. Let's get back into today's video. In a move that's already sparking widespread concern, Chancellor Rachel Reeves is reportedly considering a so-called tax raid on pensioners, all while pushing back against growing pressure from Labour's left to introduce a formal wealth tax on Britain's richest individuals. According to sources cited in The Times, Reeves is preparing to reject calls for a sweeping wealth tax, despite influential Labour figures, including former party leader Lord Kinnock, advocating for it. Kinnock has proposed a 2% tax on assets worth over £10 million, a measure he claims could raise £11 billion to help address what's being described as Reeves's budget black hole. But the Treasury appears unmoved. One senior government source said that while Reeves isn't expected to publicly rule out the wealth tax largely to avoid alienating certain factions within the party, she is not planning to implement it. Instead, more politically viable options remain under consideration, namely raising capital gains tax or targeting pensioners' tax reliefs, which, as the source noted, could technically be spun as a form of wealth tax. The reason for Reeves's reluctance? According to ministers, the math and the history simply don't add up. Wealth taxes, a non-starter. Around the world, multiple cabinet members have reportedly dismissed the wealth tax proposal as a non-starter. One insider bluntly stated, "Wealthy people are mobile. They can just move their assets abroad. These taxes don't raise the kind of money we need." The international track record backs up their point. While only 4 countries currently impose a wealth tax, Colombia, Norway, Spain, and Switzerland, 8 others that once tried it have since abandoned the idea. This includes Germany, France, Denmark, and Sweden, all of which concluded the tax was either inefficient, damaging to investment, or administratively burdensome. Even within Labour's own ranks, skepticism runs deep. Dan Nidal, a Labour member and tax lawyer, went so far as to call wealth taxes fantasy politics and lazy sloganeering. In his words, they just don't raise much, and wherever they've been introduced, they've brought in a pittance. Nidal also warned that pushing for such a measure could actually undermine Britain's economic prospects. For a government that says it prioritises growth, a wealth tax would be a counterintuitive move. Anything that creates a hostile climate for investment has an impact. Stealth taxes, the real revenue source. While Reeves resists a formal wealth tax, her team is quietly preparing to squeeze revenue from elsewhere, namely through the extension of existing stealth taxes. Currently, income tax thresholds and national insurance bans are frozen until 2028. This means that as wages rise with inflation, more people automatically fall into higher tax brackets, a policy known as fiscal drag. Now, Reeves is expected to extend that freeze until 2030, potentially raking in an additional £7 billion over the 2-year extension. Critics say this move directly contradicts Labour's pledge not to raise taxes on working people. But technically, Reeves wouldn't need to change the rates. The higher tax intake would come simply from letting inflation do the work. Where this leaves Labour, Reeves's balancing act reflects a wider tension within Labour. How to present the party as both economically credible to voters and socially fair to its base. On one hand, the leadership knows it must avoid spooking investors and middle-income earners in the run-up to the next election. On the other, pressure from Labour's left and traditional supporters continues to mount for a tougher stance on extreme wealth. By keeping the door slightly ajar to so-called wealth tax alternatives, like taxing capital gains or pension reliefs, Reeves may hope to strike that balance. But for now, one thing is clear. A formal headline-grabbing wealth tax, the kind Kinnock and others have called for, is firmly off the table. And if pensioners are the ones left footing the bill instead, expect Labour to face some difficult questions from its own voters. In other news, Reform UK's hopes of generating a tartan tidal wave have been handed a damning verdict as a pollster has said that the party's values do not fully resonate with Scottish voters. According to a recent MRP poll by think tank More in Common, the SNP is set to make a major comeback in the next general election, returning to 2019 levels of strength and bagging 41 of the 57 seats available in Scotland. Some 31 of those seats will come at the expense of Labour, but an extensive analysis by the People's Channel has discovered Reform will jump to second place in 10 of those constituencies. And among the 8 instances where John Swinney's party is expected to hold their seats, half of them will see Reform stealth their way into the second spot, for a total of 14. However, with what a source described as an impenetrable wall created by the SNP, pollsters have shed light on how Reform is expected to fare in the battle for Scotland. Nigel Farage's meteoric rise in the country, according to pollsters, is more a story of growing disappointment in Labour and the Conservatives, with Scottish voters unsure of how the Populist Party's values align with their own, especially on independence. When asked whether Scots think Reform UK aligns with their values, George Buchan, founder of GB Insight, told GB News, Reform UK's recent surge in Scotland appears to be driven more by frustration with both Labour and the Conservatives than by a strong alignment with Scottish values. Polling shows Reform is attracting significant support from former Conservative voters, as well as drawing some backing from Labour, SNP, and Liberal Democrat supporters. More in Common's polling, more nationally, showed Reform UK rising to take 290 seats across England and Wales, 223 of which come directly at the expense of Labour. The think tank reveals that under this projection, you could walk from Workington to Hartlepool and then all the way down the east of England to Clacton without leaving a Reform seat. However, Buchan notes that Reform faces a roadblock when it comes to the Saltire estate, as Scottish voters struggle to identify with the party. Reform is still widely perceived as an England-based party, he continued, and its right-wing populist positioning does not fully resonate with the broader Scottish electorate, which tends to lean more progressive on key issues. The party's rise reflects a search for an alternative among unionist voters dissatisfied with the main parties, rather than a wholesale embrace of Reform's values. Echoing Buchan's points about the dissatisfaction with the main political parties and the SNP's predicted sweep of Scotland, veteran polling guru Sir John Curtis explained, "It's a story of Labour collapse, not SNP recovery. Average Scotland vote changes in the poll are Labour minus 15.4 and the SNP plus 3.1. The main advance is by Reform plus 14.1, but not enough to get them any seats in this poll. Reform has brushed aside assertions that Farage's five-strong band is England-based, with the party's Scotland director, Martin Green, explaining, Reform UK has now got over 11,000 members in Scotland and 15 councillors, all based in their communities across Scotland. The idea we are not a Scottish party is for the bird. Nigel Farage will fight for every person across Britain, including here in Scotland." Responding directly to the point about the party not aligning with Scottish values, Green continued, "We do. Reform UK stands for common sense and we'll bring that back to Holyrood. We'd utilise our North Sea assets, scrap net stupid zero, stand up for women's rights, stop the population explosion and lower taxes." Drawing a comparison to the Scottish parliamentary election in Hamilton last month, Reform Scottish spokesman believes the party can stand shoulder to shoulder with the SNP. The by-election saw Reform's Ross Lambie scoop 7,088 votes, coming in just shy of second place behind the SNP's Katie Loudon on 7,957 and Labour's winner Davy Russell on 8,559 votes. Green said Reform UK has already shown we are competitive against the SNP as well as Labour in Scotland. The Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse by-election showed SNP vote collapse while Reform made significant gains. Scotland is scunnered with the SNP after almost 2 decades in charge, and only Reform is offering change. When approached for comment on the polling, an SNP source made clear that the threat of Nigel Farage's party was real. They said, "The SNP is going into the next election to win across Scotland. The prospect of Nigel Farage becoming Prime Minister, even without winning a single seat in Scotland, is very real, and the only way to ensure Scotland always gets the government it votes for is with the full powers of independence." The constituency of Dunfermline and Dollar is one seat in which the MRP polling shows the SNP arresting power from Labour. Its current MP, Graham Downey, brushed aside the threat of the SNP and Reform, using the Hamilton by-election as evidence when he announced yesterday, "You've got real-world evidence of what polls thought. They said we wouldn't win the Hamilton by-election and that we'd finish third behind Reform, but we won it. There's a large extent of Scotland where the polls haven't really adjusted to what is essentially a 3-party system, now between Labour, the SNP and Reform." Downey also brushed aside any notion that Reform's values don't align with the Scottish electorate and reflected the SNP's stance of taking the threat from Nigel Farage seriously. He continued, "There's not as much difference between voters in Scotland and England. The public in Scotland has the same kind of concerns as those in England. An inner-city voter in Glasgow is similar to an inner-city voter in Manchester. Reform's polling in Scotland is strong. They had a strong performance in the Hamilton by-election. It's a line that the SNP have made to find Scottish exceptions that we're different from the UK. But I don't think we are. I think we've got to meet Reform head-on and tackle them." Downey concluded by saying that repeated SNP failures, especially those in relation to Scotland's ailing public services, are stoking a Reform push. Adding credence to Downey's remarks, ex-Labour MP for Glasgow South, Tom Harris, whose former constituency is also predicted to flip to the SNP, warned Reform could eat into the Labour and SNP vote share. He said, "The Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse by-election in June demonstrated that there is substantial support for Reform in areas that were formerly regarded as Labour and SNP strongholds. What the SNP most fear, however, is a repeat of the Hamilton effect, where a decent performance by Reform splits the anti-Labour vote and allows them to hold on, as they did, narrowly in Hamilton." However, the SNP isn't the only one peddling a ticket of pro-Scottish values. Alba Party Deputy Leader Neil Hanvey told the People's Channel, "The rise in support for Reform since last year's UK general election reflects the widespread anger at the Labour government's utter failure to deliver for working people." Hanvey added, "The results of the Westminster poll come 4 years out from the next UK general election, but demonstrate clearly that voting patterns are diverging north and south of the border, with a Reform majority in England, and also in Wales, and a pro-independence majority in Scotland. The only Reform Scotland needs is independence. The only way to stop the Reform bandwagon in its tracks is to vote Alba on the regional list." Asked whether Nigel Farage swiping the keys to number 10 would cause a surge in Scots calling for independence, Buchan said, "It is likely that calls for an independence referendum would intensify if Nigel Farage were to enter government. The SNP and other pro-independence voices would be able to frame a Farage-led government as unrepresentative of Scottish values and priorities, echoing arguments made after the Brexit referendum. This narrative could resonate even with some Scots who are not committed independence supporters, as it highlights the perceived democratic deficit between Scotland and Westminster." Remarking in further analysis of the MRP polling, Jake Dibden, a research fellow at More in Common, said, "It is worth noting that while Reform placed second behind either the SNP or Labour in only 14 of the 57 seats, recent polling has suggested that they would win just under a fifth of the popular vote were a Westminster election held today. Though this is lower than in the rest of the country, it far exceeds any level of support enjoyed by UKIP at its peak. If it is the view of the Scottish people that Reform is an England-based party, this certainly seems to be less of a problem for them than Reform's political predecessors. It is also worth noting that given the historic underperformance of the right in Scotland, it is unlikely that Scotland is fundamentally stale ground for Reform in particular, and more likely that the current level of support they appear to enjoy there is either typical or impressive for a party that occupies their political ground in British politics. The SNP has long stated its opposition to Nigel Farage as a politician, and has a record of staking cases for Scottish independence on the success of right-wing political campaigns, most notably Brexit, to which Farage has often been intimately related. As a nationalist party, it is undoubtedly likely that the SNP will use the possibility of a Reform victory in Westminster, or a coalition including Reform, as the basis for another push for an independence referendum. Asked whether Reform would allow an independence referendum in Scotland, Green said, "No. Reform UK is an unashamedly pro-UK party and makes no apology for that." What are your thoughts on what we discussed in today's video? Let me know down in the comment section below. If you have not yet already, make sure you do drop a like on this video and subscribe to the channel for more British content. Thank you, take care, goodbye.